So I went on a couple of hitchhiking trips with George, which were great, and they're very bonding. So that was before the Beatles. So when we became the Beatles, we knew we had those memories already in common.
For many years, the world saw them as two members of the greatest band in history. But behind the music was a friendship few people truly understood. Paul McCartney and George Harrison grew up side by side, chased the same dream, and helped change music forever. Yet behind the fame, there were constant, ugly disagreements, years of distance, and words left unsaid. And by the time George took his final breath, Paul had a lot to say about his late friend. Were they good things? And what was the statement George made that hurt Paul deeply? Join us as we tell the untold story of one of the Beatles' most complicated friendships. The Boys on the Bus. The story of Paul McCartney and George Harrison began on a bus. An ordinary, everyday bus making its way through the streets of Liverpool, carrying two schoolboys who had no idea that one day the whole world would know their names. It was 1954, and both boys were attending the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul McCartney was a year ahead of George in school, and even then, he was the kind of kid that people naturally paid attention to. He was sharp and funny, and seemed to have a natural feel for music instilled in him from a very early age. His father, Jim McCartney, had led a jazz band back in the 1920s, so music was not just something Paul did, it was something he had grown up breathing. By the time he was a teenager, he had already moved through piano and found his way to guitar. George Harrison was a different kind of boy entirely. A year younger than Paul, quieter, and, by his own words later in life, deeply miserable at school. He once said that his time at the Liverpool Institute was the worst period of his entire life. The strict rules, the uniforms, and the feeling that everything had to be done one particular way and no other all felt like a cage to him. George was the kind of young person who was searching for something without yet knowing what that something was. What brought the two of them together was not their schoolwork, it was music. And more specifically, it was those long bus rides into town where the rules of school felt far away, and the two of them could just talk. George noticed that Paul was always carrying a guitar, and that was all it took to get a conversation started. Both boys were completely swept up in the skiffle craze that was running through Britain at the time. Skiffle was rough, noisy, homemade music, and that was exactly what made it feel so alive and exciting. It was telling young people that you did not need to be trained professionally or talented in any formal way to make it or be cool. You just needed an instrument, a bit of fire in your belly, and a few friends willing to make noise with you. Both of them had also fallen hard for the American artists who were turning the music world upside down at the time. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly. George, in particular, had been stopped completely in his tracks the first time he heard Heartbreak Hotel drifting out of someone's window on a Liverpool street. From that single moment, he was obsessed. He filled his school notebooks with drawings of guitars instead of doing his lessons, and he practiced chord after chord at home until his fingers ached. By 1956, George had already put together a small skiffle group with his brother Peter and a friend. He called it the Rebels, which was not an accident. It was a name he used to pay homage to what he felt at the moment. By 1957, Paul had joined a band called the Quarrymen, led by a slightly older boy named John Lennon. When the group began looking for another guitar player, Paul immediately thought of George. John Lennon was not convinced at first. He looked at George and thought he was too young, too small, and too boyish to be taken seriously. But George was not going to be turned away that easily. One evening, sitting on the top deck of a bus in Liverpool, He picked up a guitar and played a clean, note-perfect version of a rockabilly song called Raunchy by Bill Justice. Lennon listened. He could not argue with what he heard. George was in. And with that, the group that would one day become the most famous band in history had found its core. In the years that followed, the three of them spent hours together learning new chords, trading ideas, and slowly daring to imagine a life bigger than anything Liverpool seemed to offer. And in those moments, Paul became something of an older brother figure to George from the very beginning. But that brotherly bond would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have predicted, as the pressure of fame began to change everything between them. The pressure of fame. As the Beatles grew famous, slowly at first and then suddenly all at once, the relationship between Paul and George became more complicated and harder to navigate. By the early 1960s, Beatlemania had swept through Britain and then crashed across the rest of the world like a wave that would not stop. The band was no longer just a group of young men from Liverpool playing pubs and small venues. They were the most talked about, most written about, and most screamed at group of musicians on the planet. And with that level of fame came a pressure most human beings are simply not built to handle. Inside that pressure, Paul McCartney naturally stepped into the role of the band's creative driving force. He loved being in the studio. He pushed constantly for new ideas, new sounds, new ways of doing things. He wanted every record to be better than the one before it. And he had the energy, the confidence, and the stubbornness to push everyone around him toward that goal. In many ways, this was one of Paul's greatest strengths. But for George, standing inside that pressure day after day, it started to feel less like creative energy and more like being squeezed out of the room. The clearest sign of this tension came during the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. The album was largely Paul's project, a big, theatrical, high-concept record that would go on to become one of the most celebrated in music history. But for George, the making of it was a reminder of just how little space was left for anything he wanted to say. His only contribution to the record was a track called Within You Without You, which stemmed from a deep interest in Indian music and Eastern thought that had been growing within him for several years. To Paul, it was just another song on a record. But to George, it was something that came from a very personal place, an expression of where he was heading spiritually and as a person. They were no longer really speaking the same language, and the distance between them was widening. That distance became even clearer when the Beatles traveled to India in 1968 to study transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. For George, this was one of the most important experiences of his life. He had been moving toward Eastern philosophy and spiritual ideas for some time, and going to India felt like arriving somewhere he had been looking for without knowing it. Paul had a very different reaction. He was interested, but he experienced the retreat more as just another pointless vacation. At some point during the trip, Paul apparently made a light joke to George, telling him to relax and calm down. George did not find it funny in the slightest. He felt that the Beatles had become so wrapped up in the business of being famous that there was no room left for anything with real meaning. The joke felt like Paul dismissing the most important journey George had ever taken. As the years went by, George was developing into a serious writer and a serious thinker, someone who had real things to say and real music to make. But inside the Beatles, his songs were always treated as the lesser option. Songs like All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill were put aside again and again during recording sessions while the Lennon-McCartney catalog took everything. George had been patient about it for years, but patience runs out. The patience George had carried for so long was about to break completely. And when it did, no one in the room would be able to ignore it. The breaking point. By 1969, things had reached a point where they simply could not continue the way they were anymore. The band had agreed to be filmed during rehearsals and recording sessions for a project that would eventually become the Let It Be film. And in one exchange that was captured on film, Paul could be seen explaining to George exactly how he thought a guitar part should be played. Although explaining to Paul that he would play whatever Paul wanted, he felt really bad at the on-screen outburst. Following this, years and years of frustration plagued their friendship. Then, on the 10th of January, 1969, George randomly and angrily walked out of the rehearsals. Although not saying anything at the moment, later, he stated that staying with the others had become deeply unhealthy and unhappy for him. The others were rattled by this. George was not just the lead guitarist. He was part of the balance that held the whole thing together. They eventually persuaded him to come back 12 days later, and recording continued. But, as George himself said, the damage was permanent. In a private conversation that was later documented, Paul admitted to John that George's songwriting had reached a point where it was at least as good as theirs. He said it in a way that suggested he was surprised by this, as if he were only now noticing something that had been true for a long time. And when George found out about this comment, he was not moved by it in a positive way. He did not see himself as someone who had finally arrived. He felt that he had been producing strong, meaningful work for years and had simply never been given the space to show it. He felt that he had been purposely overlooked all those years. And when the Beatles broke apart in 1970, he released a grieving song. A sound of a person sadly trying to understand how things had gone so wrong between two people who had once been so close. But even in the middle of all that grief, music would find a way of bringing them back together one more time before everything fell apart. Completely. One last moment. Before the final collapse, something remarkable happened. In 1969, the Beatles came together to record what would turn out to be their last album, Abbey Road. The atmosphere was not warm, and the tensions were thick. But what came out of those sessions was something truly special. And a great deal of what made it special came directly from George Harrison. He brought two songs to those sessions that would go on to become some of the most loved recordings in all of popular music. Here Comes the Sun and Something are two remarkable songs that the world could not ignore. John Lennon himself said it was the best track on the entire album. But it was different with Paul, as he had mixed feelings about it. Sadly, the official end of the Beatles came the following year, and each of them went in separate directions. George put everything he had been holding back into All Things Must Pass, and then turned his energy toward organizing the concert for Bangladesh in 1971. When organizing, he invited Paul to take part, but Paul said no. In their relationship, that refusal served as another wound, another moment that added distance between them. Their interviews through the 1970s occasionally contained hidden jabs thrown at each other's faces. And in one instance, George said that he could picture himself playing music again with John Lennon one day, but not with Paul. Paul felt that. It was a hard thing to hear from someone he had known since they were boys. Time, as it tends to do, would eventually wear down some of the hardest edges, but it would take something truly special to bring them properly back together. The coming back together. By the early 1990s, enough time had passed that Paul and George could finally sit in the same room without the old battles catching fire the moment they walked in. What brought them back together was one of the most emotional musical projects either of them would ever be involved in. On the 11th of February, 1994, Paul, George, and Ringo gathered at Paul's studio to finish songs that John Lennon had left behind before his death. For fans everywhere, it felt like something close to a miracle. The three surviving Beatles in the same room, working on recordings that still carried John's voice. But even in that tender situation, the old patterns were not completely gone. George came in with firm opinions about how things should be handled. He insisted that his close friend Jeff Lynne produce the sessions, and he warned Paul directly that without a neutral person in the room to keep things on track, things could turn ugly fast. And even though Paul later admitted that George had been absolutely right, it didn't really go as planned. Jeff Lynne came on board, and together they completed 2 songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love. And it was during those sessions that Paul and George found things to disagree about. Paul wanted everything to sound like the Beatles at their most recognizable, but George preferred something simpler and more personal. They argued about guitar parts, lyrics, and what the whole project was really supposed to mean. And yet, somehow, they worked through every single disagreement. The songs came together, and in doing so, they quietly built a small but real bridge back to the bond they had shared as young men on the streets of Liverpool. That bridge, small as it was, would matter more than either of them could have known. Because the time they had left together was running shorter than anyone wanted to admit. The remnants of an era. Away from the studio, the relationship between them was still fragile, but Paul had begun speaking about George differently in public. During the moments after the records were released, he would openly admit that he had underestimated him, that he had not always seen him clearly. On the other hand, George never stopped being honest about finding Paul overwhelming. George never failed to admit that underneath all the years of tension and competition and long silence, something had always been there that neither of them could fully walk away from. They had known each other since they were children and had built something together that changed the world. That kind of history does not simply disappear, no matter how much pain surrounds it. But sadly, as the 1990s ended, George's health began to fail seriously. Throat cancer came first in 1997, then lung cancer, then a brain tumor. Simultaneously, adding to his problems, in December of 1999, an intruder broke into his home and attacked him with a knife, leaving him physically weakened, further worsening his predicament. Paul reportedly visited when he could during those final years, but the old tension between them had still not vanished, and even though it had changed into something quieter, it was still there. Paul described the dynamic as one of those situations where, when someone you have known your whole life is running out of time, the things that once felt so important begin to look very small. Much to the whole world's dismay, on the 29th of November, 2001, George Harrison passed away. He was 58 years old, and by his wishes, his ashes were scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, a country that had meant more to him than almost anywhere else on earth. Paul later spoke about one of the last times he sat with George in a hospital in New York, spending hours by his side, talking and laughing about small things the way they had as boys. At one point, they held hands. Paul said that in their younger years, 2 lads from Liverpool would never have done something like that. But there they were. In the years since, Paul has kept a fir tree that George once gave him, planted near the gate of his home. Every time he passes it, he whispers hello to his late friend. George's son, Donnie, and Paul's daughter, Stella, have remained close, carrying the warmth of that old friendship forward into a new generation. Free from the rivalry their fathers never fully escaped. And that is how their story played out. 2 boys from Liverpool who found each other on a bus, changed the world together, spent decades trying to work out what they meant to each other, and in the end, held hands. What is your favorite George Harrison song? And do you think Paul was right when he finally admitted that George's best work could stand alongside anything he and John ever wrote? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.